Okay, I think we're ready to get started. I'm Jamie Fly. I'm the president of Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, originally from the US, but now based here in Prague. You may ask why the president of Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty is moderating this session. So we do surrogate journalism in 22 countries around the world, soon to be 23 next year when we relaunch our Hungarian service. And so the fate of democracy is incredibly important to us, and we believe that we contribute to democratic development through support for a free and independent media. So our panel today is entitled Running a Country According to Likes, which I think raises a number of interesting questions, including what do democratic societies expect from their political leaders in the modern era, whether short-term political decisions based on immediate feedback have started to corrode and undermine our democracy, and how political leaders are dealing with this new environment where they have tools to reach a broader number of their citizens in real time and also gauge reaction and what that's meant for responsible political leadership. And I'd like to use the conversation today to get into all those topics, as well as just some basic conversation about how technology itself is influencing democracy. We've seen technology contribute to revolutions, if you think of the Arab Spring, but now, and a lot of the conversation here at Forum 2000 this year is about how authoritarians are on the offensive, are using technology and other tools to their advantage to push back against democracy, and how many democratic societies, as they have a diverse set of tools to get news and information, are more easily manipulated and are, in some cases, becoming increasingly polarized, partly through technology. So we have a great group of panelists today to discuss these topics. Immediately to my right is Anna Lohrmann, who's Deputy Director of Varieties of Democracy, the VDEM Institute, and from Germany, but now based in Gothenburg, Sweden. To her right, we have Jan Zielonka, who's a professor of European politics at St. Antony's College at the University of Oxford. And then to my left, we have Josiah Ober, who's a professor of political science and classics at Stanford University in the US. So I believe Anna's the only person on the panel who actually has been a politician, so I thought I'd start with her. And Anna, get your thoughts about how deep is the problem with democracy right now? Is the problem really the kind of lack of political leadership and short-termism in our democratic objectives, or is something deeper going on, especially given what we've seen with authoritarians capitalizing on this moment?
Well, I think we indeed have a deep problem with democracy right now in the world, and that problem is called, or we call it, autocratization. And that is that elected leaders gradually undermine democratic rules when they are in power. We've seen this in Hungary. We see this to some extent in Poland, to dramatic extent in Turkey and in Russia. And this global trend of autocratization is something that is really worrisome, and I think that is very much linked to the major shifts in the media environment that we have seen in the last 10 years. You alluded to that I used to be a politician. I served my last term in the Bundestag until 2009, and when I left, there was no Twitter, or politicians didn't use Twitter, at least at that point in time. No Facebook, right? So I mean, it's only 10 years. I'm still quite a young person, but the whole way politics is done has shifted dramatically, and the important role of the media as an intermediary between citizens and politicians is eroding, is shifting, and that makes it very easy for populist leaders to manipulate the electorate.
Jan, I'm curious, given your work on especially the way that the EU and European governments have dealt with this challenge, do you think that Europe is somewhat uniquely susceptible to this backsliding? Obviously, there are other democracies in the world that are dealing with similar challenges. But is this really part a European phenomenon? And if so, what do European governments need to do differently, and what does the EU need to do to adapt to this new environment?
Europe invented democracy. So if democracy is in trouble in Europe, where would you expect to flourish? And of course, the problem is that the EU itself has a democracy problem. And you know, Ralph Dahrendorf used to joke, somebody who was a member of the European Commission, used to joke that EU wouldn't pass democracy test. It basically presents as conditions to those who want to achieve some assistance from the EU. So you know, all this became really tricky. But I don't think the problem is the situations of today. I think democracy was always in crisis since the Greek times, when there was different technology introduced, different modes of communication. And you know, we had different democracy in Athens. We had different democracy when print was invented. When radio and television was introduced, people also said, oh, this is the end of democracy. And now we have to get used to social networks. But it doesn't mean that democracy will die, because people always will demand a say in public decisions. And it would have to be organized one way or another because of grassroots pressure. And now the question is, what would replace the democracy we have of today? I mean, will the nation state will be still the basic unit of democracy, even if most of the problems this unit is supposed to solve are either local or transnational? And will national parliaments will be the major seat of democratic governance, even if the parties which select those members of parliament are basically artificial entities with no loyal support of voters, let alone members. Yeah? And so on. So various institutions of democracy probably would have to be changed. Only at the beginning, it is the irony of history that the only sort of movements that don't call themselves even parties who experiment with e-democracy are those who we call populists, you know, like Cinque Stelle or like Podemos, and the liberals are making fun of them. So we are in a very early stage. This adjustment is painful, and it manifests itself in a very, very simple way, that those voters who were loyal to liberal parties for some 3-4 decades decided to have enough, and they started to look for alternatives. These are not always nativist right-wing parties. There are some Greens, there are sometimes new movements, new parties, but they do not do what they used to do for many decades, to alternate between center-left and center-right. And so there is a problem. But the problem is not only in the vote. The problem, which is probably the most tricky, and here I finish, is that there is a breakdown of ideological consensus. Liberalism was a kind of hegemonic ideology which defined the notion of what is rational and absurd, what is normal and what is aberration. And now those new kids on the block introduce new notions of normality, and there is a problem with the adjustments. So it doesn't concern only issues of migrants or economics. It concerns even the way we dress, the way we talk, So it's a package, and with the package it's very difficult to grapple, because if it would be only of policy of inequality, we could focus and try to fix it. But this is much more about this, you know. Yeah.
Josiah, do you share that assessment, given your historical work, that what we're going through now in many democratic societies is not all that different than some of the turbulence that democracies have experienced over time, and just we need some adaptation, democratic reform of democratic institutions, and we'll come out the other side okay?
Yeah, so I think one way to try to frame what's going on today is to look at the lens of history. My work has focused on ancient Greek democracy, especially in Athens. And we might just start out by asking an ancient Greek, what does the word mean? You guys made it up, you Greeks, so what do you mean by it? So do you mean just that the majority rules and the majority can do whatever it pleases? Whatever is the opinion of the many is the rule. And that's not what they meant. It's very clear that what the Greeks meant by demokratia, this word that gives us, Greek word that gives us our contemporary term, what they meant was the capacity of a citizenship, of a people, to do things, to make history, to make their own history. So the demos, the citizens, have the kratos, the capacity to do things. So what does it take then to do things if you're a large community? Many more than can get together face to face and talk things through. Well, what it requires, at least, is that you are able to deliver the things that every government must deliver if it is to exist as a government. And that's basic welfare and basic security. Without that, you have no government. Democracy will have no legitimacy. But there's a third thing that the ancient Greeks thought that democracy was at its core, and I think they were right, and that is democracy is anti-tyranny. And I really believe that there are only two possibilities. Either you have government by the people, or their representatives, but ultimately by the people, or you have government by a tyrant. The tyrant might be one individual, it might be a junta, a gang, but ultimately it's either the people or a tyrant. So that's the bottom line. So what do you need to have that people govern instead of a tyrant? And bottom line is you have to have freedom of speech and freedom of assembly, freedom to come together. And this is before you even have these as any kind of an idea of a right or a human right. This is just the baseline essential, what you cannot do democracy without. And then you have to have baseline equality. You have to have political equality. You have to have the idea that one citizen has the same weight in our decisions than every other citizen. Once again, that doesn't have to become a reified ideal. It's just a baseline condition without which there cannot be the rule of the people. So what happens when you have freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, equality of influence? You have to get together and make decisions. You have to do it ultimately by some kind of a vote, and you have to precede that vote by some kind of a deliberation. So how are you going to do that? Ultimately, you're going to have a way to listen to experts. There have got to be people who are acknowledged to know more about some topic than other people. But in the end, it has to be the decision of the people coming together, and therefore we have opinion. Opinion ultimately about whose expertise, whose idea about a policy is worth following. And because of that, in antiquity as today, we have this problem of the possibility of government by likes. somebody who is a spurious expert, but tremendously good at getting the attention of people. And we had the problem in antiquity of technology, of not the kind of technology we think about in Silicon Valley, not big data, but the kind of technology that was developed by people who were professional orators, professional sophists, teachers of the skills of rhetoric. They were really good at this, and their whole idea was, I can make you, a citizen, like what I like. I can cause you to desire what I want you to desire. I can get you to believe what I want you to believe. And I'm really, really good at this. So the question for democracy has always been, is the people going to be swept away by this kind of technology of liking and desiring and believing? Or will the people be able to find their own way to use what they know collectively to come to some kind of a decision? That's really the rub. It was in ancient Athens, it is today. The Athenians figured it out, we have to figure it out as well.
I think you raised a couple of interesting points, and picking up on Jan also talked about the collapse of the consensus. And in a lot of our societies, I'm thinking certainly of the US case, but I've seen it also here in European democracies, there's this sense amongst the public that the elites have, even when they've been voted into office or supported by the public, have not delivered for them. And so there's this disconnect where they've gotten that political support, and then the elites are perceived to fail, as having failed to deliver. So Anna, how do we overcome this elite masses divide that's emerged in many of our democracies, especially it's kind of ironically at a time when the elites can actually take the pulse of the masses much more easily than perhaps in the past, and on an ongoing, even minute-by-minute basis?
Well, I think, first of all, by making clear that there's not the elite. No? We had a very passionate speech this morning by the new Prime Minister of Moldova, and she made it very clear you can only improve politics if the good people decide to go into politics and become politicians, right? So the point is that our democratic system, the absence of tyranny, allows everyone to make their voice heard and to take the path of going into politics, assemble, associate, express their speech, and then become part of a new elite, if you wish, right? And I think it's very important to put this more center stage, particularly also in new democracies. I was just in Tunisia last week to observe the elections, and you can see still a high support for the idea of democracy, of voting. But we need to make it clear that if you want to have democracy, you need to have somebody who you can then elect and who represents you. Thus, you cannot say that all politicians and political parties are in one basket and corrupt, and you hit on them. So I think also we shouldn't really fall into this rhetorical trap that illiberal leaders, political leaders are now trying to do. But I think it's important to differentiate and to say, okay, you have maybe some political parties, some political leaders that you might not like. And here, I refer to, in the case of Europe, the representatives of the old catch-all parties, right? Like in the German case, CDU, SPD, who sort of, I think, over the last decades didn't really show enough leadership in the sense of standing for a clear and distinct program that voters could recognize. And this then laid the fertile ground for these, what you call new kids on the block, to rise and to say, hey, we stand for something completely different, vote for us and everything will be better, right? And in principle, there's nothing to say in a democracy against new parties arising. I mean, on the contrary, that's great. That's great about it. No, we can renew our political leadership without taking up weapons, right? If there are new grievances, new topics that the old leadership doesn't address, others can form political parties and come into office. That's a great thing. But the problem is if these new political actors are illiberal and question the very foundations of democracy that you said that the ancient Greece already pointed out, namely freedom of speech and freedom of association. And that is that then parties get voted, illiberal parties get voted into office that actually use this freedom to abolish freedom. This classical paradox of freedom. So I think this is the challenge where we stand. Not that there was some sort of a fatigue and new actors rising. I think it's great that if new parties come on the block and new actors, but they have to be on the grounds of the liberal orders. Otherwise, we cannot sustain democracy.
Jan, can you pick up on that? And I'm just curious about Josiah's point about just how to move towards consensus in our societies. And again, at the European context, I mean, are there any countries in Europe right now where you see them outside the norm here, that they're not following the trend of many of the frustration, apathy amongst voters and general support for the party options that they have and support for their leaders? Are there any success stories in Europe right now that you would point to?
Let me first start with what was said before about Athens. It is absolutely correct to say that democracy is the role for the people, by the people. But the notions of the people has changed. Women got a vote only very recently. Usually, those who had access to democratic decisions were either nobles or people with certain wealth.
Not in Athens,
yeah.
Not wealth. That was the breakthrough. That's what made it democracy. Yeah.
So it's, and certainly ethnic minorities very often were excluded, and the whole notions of citizenship was, let's say, manipulated a little bit and still is. Yeah. So what I want to say is that the notions who has democratic rights is always subject to change. And usually those rights are not being given by enlightened government, they are being fought for. Otherwise, they are not being given. That is important because this happened not just this struggle for your citizens' right, or for instance of women, doesn't only represent the history of non-democratic countries. It happened in our democracies. We constantly were struggling for making democracy stronger. Now is the issue how you evaluate the success, democratic success. I somehow don't get thrilled by the narrative, that we are having now the choice between Europe of Viktor Orban or Emmanuel Macron. I mean, for me, both are populists, although of different types. I prefer Emmanuel Macron having consultations throughout the country and talking to people, but at the end of the day, he takes those decisions himself and he reinforces the positions of an elite or monarch who basically listen to people but then tries to do things for them. And the whole struggle is that people want the government not only to be for them with mixed results, but also by them. And the way to involve people in decision-making process is today at stake. And partly because those who are at decision-making table don't want others to to enter this room, but partly because these participatory forms of democracy, it's easier by nature to organize in local communities than national communities, let alone transnational communities. This is why it is so difficult in Europe to involve citizens in this decision-making, because this is a very transnational polity. And And the whole art is, as somebody who studied democracy knows the name, Robert Dahl once described. This is the dilemma between participation and efficiency. Because he wrote this beautiful piece in the early 90s when the Danish had to decide whether they will give more powers to Brussels. And he said, no, if you are a real democrat, you shouldn't give more powers to Brussels because, of course, if government is about participation, the government in Brussels will be much further away from you than the government here in Copenhagen. It's obvious because of the distance and understanding of the local context. The problem is that if this government in Copenhagen has to cope with transnational problems and to deliver on democratic or electoral, if you wish, promises, it needs to have the weight to deal with those transnational corporations or with the climate change, right? And then it is not enough that the government is close to you, because it can be close, it can reflect your preferences, but it cannot do anything about this, because this government in Brussels is in a better position, theoretically, than the government in Copenhagen. So this is all about balancing those things. It's not always that you have one single way of fixing these two requirements. Yeah? But the trick is that we have broken this balance. We have in the European Union put too much emphasis on efficiency rather than participation. There's hardly any way except European elections for citizens to take part in those decisions. Most of this is not only done by governments, but in a very secretive ways. And I'm not even talking about shady relationship between commissions or members of the European Parliament with lobbyists. You know, this is one of the things I don't understand why they still are allowed to do this. But the institutions have become less efficient too. Because when we had financial crisis and then migration crisis, you can argue that those institutions actually made things worse rather than better. So we faced both efficiency challenge and participation challenge. And none of those are being solved unless you believe that Mr. Erdogan will keep, our immigration problems far away from our shores. We will see how long.
Josiah, do you want to pick up on that? And especially, I'm curious about this notion of a responsible populism, essentially, the Macron version of populism, and whether you think that's truly possible in many of our societies.
Yeah, I think one of the real key problems that democracy has today is exactly this issue, that there's a sense by many people that they're simply not being represented by the government. They have no real participation, that government is happening some way, a long way from them, by people who aren't really worrying about their interests. And this leaves an opening for populists who say, I speak directly for you. I am you. I am the people. So that's the great lie of populism, is the leader claims to be the people and to speak for the people. But they say something that is attractive because they actually say, we matter. There is a we. There is a definable we, and that we matter, and that we shouldn't be pushed around by them, that they are tyrannizing now over us. So I think this is really the great challenge. I mean, as you say, how we get participation into a system without completely losing efficiency. And so I think this really is a problem of political communication. One of the real mistakes that modern-day democracies make is they fail to recognize the power of direct communication of a politician, a leader, an expert, to an audience in a language that the audience can genuinely respond to, that they feel, that they believe. This is the opening that populists leap into, because you look at a populist and you find a great communicator. One might not like to admit it, but they are. They're really good. They jump on whatever the new technology is. Whether in the 1930s it was radio, whether in the 21st century it's Twitter. They're just good at it. They're good at speaking directly to a large audience. Democratic politicians have to find a way to do that, have to find a way to, in fact, be able to speak to a large audience in a way that the audience actually responds. Once again, we go back to classical antiquity. This is the key to the success of Athenian democracy. A mass audience, of course, much smaller than contemporary mass audiences, but in the tens of thousands of people listening to individuals who were in various ways elite, relatively well educated, relatively wealthy usually, who took leadership positions, but who spoke in a way that could directly reach their audience. And if they didn't speak in that way, they were rejected by the audience. Now, the danger is you get the ones who are only good at attracting the excitement of the audience. And that can happen. But over time, if you look at the history of ancient Athens, the Athenian people got better at actually judging their politicians. They actually learned that when they simply went with the guy who gave you the most attractive, the most seductive, the easiest answer. It usually went badly. Now, this is part of civic education. This was referenced in the last session as well. We have to recognize that at the core of civic education is actually communication between leaders and audiences, from audiences back to leaders, so that the people in leadership positions are actually listening to what audiences want. If we don't think about how to generate a more educated populace, then we're never going to solve these problems of at what level we're making decisions. And the education has to be about learning to read the messages that are coming from leadership to the mass audience, but once again, from the mass audience back to that leadership. The leadership has to develop an ear for what they're getting back. And I'm afraid in many cases, it's that tone deafness of elite leadership that has left the way open for contemporary populism.
I think one of the challenges, at least that I've seen in the US, is many political leaders, instead of using technology as a way to gauge responses, have decided to tune out a lot of the technological, especially social media platforms, because there's too much noise and there's so much corrosion of the debate, whether it's trolling, some supported from abroad, some indigenous who are pushing a certain agenda, private interest. So Anna, given your political work, I mean, what's your sense about how responsible political leaders can actually take the pulse of the public in a way without getting dragged into some of the worst aspects of our current social media culture?
Well, I think political leaders have no choice but to use social media, obviously. And then this is the way of social communication at the moment. And I totally agree with you that we have indeed a communication problem in democracies. And also at its heart, for me, populism is a rhetorical style, right? It's not an ideology. It is a way of speaking to people that grabs their attention and that makes them feel like the person that speaks to them is one of them, right? So, and as such, as this rhetorical style, there's like normatively from a democratic perspective, there's no problem with populism because I mean it's basically a tool. It's a rhetorical style that can be used to gain support. When it becomes problematic is when it's married with authoritarian thoughts and with illiberal thoughts, and this is what we see a lot. In Europe these days, which is what we see in Trump also, right? And that's when it becomes problematic. So my advice to political leaders, to democratic political leaders, would actually be to study closely these populists, a bit like Macron has done, right? And think about, okay, what are the ways they communicate better than the more let's say, established political parties. What can we learn from them to also rejuvenate democracy? Because, I mean, as you pointed out, there's not everything is perfect. And I think there's still a lot of room for improvement. How social media, how, in general, tools of digitalizations can be used to improve democracy and to create new forums for a meaningful public deliberation online. And it's indeed I still don't understand why it's only populist or pirate parties that are using these kind of new tools to really engage in a meaningful conversation that is not just one way of, like, you know, the leader talking to an audience, but that it's really meaningful two-way and really brings the societal debate forward. I think there's much that needs to be done, and political leaders have the responsibility to use these tools in a responsible way, and also to fight for democracy. I mean, it's when I talk to people observing the election campaign in Sachsen now, in an eastern German state that just had elections that resulted in a very large vote share for the far right AfD. They said that the party that ruled the state for almost 30 years, the CDU, basically did not really engage in election campaign, apart from its leader. Like the local supporters of this party were a bit paralyzed by this new challenge from the right and did not live up to it and develop new tools and new ways of engaging. So I think it's that the passion for democracy needs to be felt in every interaction with the citizens.
Jan, before you seem to indicate that I think you agree with Josiah that maybe the current moment is similar to previous phases we've gone through in democratic development, and that maybe technology is not kind of an aberration here. It's just the newest form of transformations that we've been through in the past. I mean, do you really think that's the case, given that, at least in some of the worst situations, I think we've actually seen social media actually corrode our politics? It's amplified extreme views on the fringes in a way that I think would have been difficult in the past using previous means of news and information sharing. And is actually, I think, now opens democracies to vulnerabilities in terms of either internal or external manipulation. We've certainly seen that in the US case in 2016, perhaps around the Brexit vote in the UK. Do you really think that the technological developments that are now so central to how we debate political issues are similar to previous new forms of technology?
Each technology creates new challenges, and we have to adjust to it. And each technology has some assets and downsides. It's very much how you handle this technology. There is no doubt that the new technology has allowed alternative channels of communications to those which were controlled, basically, you can say, by intellectual elites or by people who actually finance those elites. I mean, newspapers, for instance. Why newspapers are now going out of fashion? Because there are alternative channels of communication. But you know, and everybody laments the newspapers. They say, well, they were the fora of deliberate democracy, which televisions couldn't provide, and social networks even perpetuate, even makes it worse. But you can look at newspapers from different angle. You can look at newspapers and those editorial gatekeepers who wouldn't allow any alternative views to enter, and who would basically brainwash the electorate to support ideas, interests, or parties which largely finance them. Yeah, because when I started to study media, the first things I realized that it's not only about journalists and audiences, but it's also about owners of the media. And if you don't talk about owners and business which comes out of the media, if you don't have a business model in the media, then you go under. But you can also say, so if you follow my logic, means that social networks open up the kind of controlled discourse and give other people opportunity to enter this discussion, to express this view, to communicate with each other. And of course, if you are one of those gatekeepers, you might not like it. And it is not only because of editors of certain newspapers or owners of those newspapers, it's also generational. You know, I mean, most of this communication through social media would be much easier if those parties would allow the younger people to enter into those parties, to have the voice. I mean, we are talking here with one of the youngest MP in European history. But if she would be so happy in her role as MP, she would not desert politics for academia. But what I want to say, but of course, I once tried to establish the average age of membership of British Conservative Party. And I came with the number 72 years old. This includes a lot of Oxford students, so you can imagine. And somebody corrected me, no, it's not 79, it's 16. It's not 72, but 69 or so. But it just tells you what kind of parties we're talking about. America's a bit different because parties are different. But here we can talk about communication, means of communications for a long time. It's a very important topic. But at the end of the day, we shouldn't forget that it's not only the means communications that matters, but the message and the messenger. You see, because if you don't have a good product, you can market it as much as you want, but at the end, people will vote with their feet. They may once buy the product, but then very quickly they realize it doesn't work for them. So the message is important, but the messenger is important too, because not all messengers have credibility. Because, for instance, those politicians who has been for years denying that there is any inequality growing, or for years were denying that there is climate change going on. You know, now they run under the green, banner, or try to convince that they are now going to support all these social measures which they thought unnecessary or even dangerous, but they don't have credibility. So it is not only the means of communications, but what you communicate and who does it. And I think all of those people who try to blame electorate for all the electoral kind of defeats, just should come down, look into the mirror, and try to see, do they have something for the electorate to provide them with the basic expectations, as you said, security, prosperity, and sense of justice? Do they have something? And second, do they have credibility actually to support what they claim? And my major problem is today not that those so-called populists are so brilliant, because you can say that Trump sends those tweets more regularly than anybody else, but is he so brilliant? I understand Polish. I wouldn't say that Kaczynski is so brilliant, or Viktor Orban. I mean, no. They are strong because the liberals are so weak.
I'm going to open it up in a minute and take your comments and questions, but just I do want to pick up on that and just to follow up. I mean, maybe I'm a little bit too much of a technology pessimist, but I think there's also a danger that the way that people expect in current social media culture to engage with their fellow citizens, the like culture that you know can immediately be segmented into a narrow group that cares about only a certain number of issues, view information that is custom tailored to be something that you know you're going to want to read. Over time, it has the effect of actually changing culture and changing our society, which then has an impact on how people view their place in their democracy. So, I mean, what's your take on this?
Yeah, I think if a people, or a citizenship, however you take it, subdivides into a group of sub-identities that imagine themselves as being unique, special, and irreconcilably hostile to the other identities within their community, then democracy is gone. The most you can hope for then is a kind of coalition politics in which you get enough of these groups forming some kind of a majority coalition to simply grind down the others, and you get majority tyranny of some sort or another, which, at least by my definition, is not democracy. It's something else and something much worse. So the question is, how do we push against that? And I think this is where we need really some new thinking about democratic institutions. We tend to think that the democratic institutions we have are just the ones we have. We've got constitutions, we've got political parties, we've got legislatures of various sorts. What we need are ways in which ordinary citizens can be brought together, at least on an occasional basis, at least some of them, to talk with one another face to face in a way that they actually have some time to understand what other citizens are saying and hear what the other side is concerned with. So this requires some new thinking. How can we do that? It has to be, in a sense, local. It can't be narrowly local. It has to bring local communities together with some kind of a larger national community. Frankly, this is exactly what happened in Athens at the end of the 6th century BC. It was a new form of mixing up the people, is what Aristotle says. I'm not going to try to go through a whole history lesson about how it works, but it brought together people in new kind of ways, allowed them to discuss genuinely salient questions, make important decisions for the whole of the community, did so choosing them by lottery and putting them together with fellow citizens, as I say, in a salient, actual, meaningful decision-making context. We've got to figure out some way to do that, to push against the idea that the only place you get your opinions, the only place you get your news, your understanding of the world is through the tweet of social media. And this is going to take some really, I think, bold new thought. It's possible to do. Democracy can reinvent itself, and it's going to have to reinvent itself in part at the level of thinking about how we can create new kind of institutions that create new possibilities for genuine interaction and pushing against the kind of short-termism as well as the kind of isolation into identity groups that seems to be dangerously the future if we don't do that.
I think we have time to bring in a few people from the audience with either questions or comments. So we'll start there, and I'll gather them, and then I'll turn back to the panel. Sorry.
Yeah, okay, thank you. I would like to ask this question to all of you, and you all mentioned the benefits of the social networks to create a dialogue between people, but I think you are aware of the fact that this tends to create sort of social bubbles when people can circulate one opinion and sort of isolate themselves from one another. And I wanted to ask whether you consider this as a real threat, or do you think it's just a minor disadvantage to this completely new opportunities? Thank you.
And I think right behind you there. Yeah.
I believe in ancient Athens, the most popular politicians were regularly exiled as a matter of policy. Do you think it would help today's democracy if we simply exiled people who won elections?
Can you just repeat the tail end of that? Sorry.
I didn't understand that. But
Yeah. The tail end was, well, without the front end doesn't make sense. In ancient Athens, the most popular politicians were regularly exiled as a matter of policy. Is that correct? I was just at the Athens Democracy Forum, that's what they told us there. Would it help today's democracy if we simply exiled the people who won elections?
Well, and let's, over there.
Hello, I just wanted to follow up on the idea of a culture of democracy, because I think it was Sophocles who famously in one of the plays said, put in somebody's mouth the words that poetry was an education in democracy. And Greek theatre was clearly trying to problematize moral dilemmas, perhaps with a view to making active citizens think very hard about the choices they had to make in the assembly. The same people taking part in the plays as actually were also taking part in the assembly. So I was wanting to ask all the speakers really about whether, maybe we're looking at this in a slightly different, wrong way. Is there a culture of democracy which sustains democracy? And should we be thinking one stage back about what it is that embeds culture in each of our individual behaviors?
And maybe one final question over here, and then I'll turn back to the panel.
Hi, my name is Bjørn Husted. I'm a Dane living many years in the Czech Republic and comparing a little bit the two systems. And what I'm seeing, especially powerful as such in Scandinavia, where you see people getting engaged a lot more in democracy, I think, than here, is because they have a very, very strong local democracy. So people are getting the social, or say the citizen engagement is the key to the success. They are very much involved in the local level, and that means that they are also having a much higher respect for the people that continue on a higher level in politics, and therefore also ready to let them represent them, which means that it leaves very little room for any really populistic ideas, because the citizens are actually engaged in their communities, and they will raise their voice if they hear too much populistic stuff. So I think the key to the essence is really to get down to the basic roots and getting the local communities to function. This is also where the social media and the likes for that sake could really, you could see an immediate impact on this if you first of all grow that segment.
It's a great set of comments and questions. So why don't we go in reverse order, and Josiah, I'll start with you. You can pick and choose which ones you briefly want to touch on, and then we'll wrap it up here in the next 5 minutes. So very short contributions from all of you.
Good. I have become more and more attached to the thought of that the Athenians were very wise in having the institution of ostracism. Once a year, you could have a choice of one individual, a prominent individual, that you can expel for a period of 10 years without otherwise harming the individual. You don't put them in prison, you just expel them. And you do so without a trial, simply because it is felt that that is the most dangerous person in your community. Aristotle thought this was a pretty harsh way to do things, but he said, it's a pretty efficient way to do things too. Culture, absolutely. We need to actually think about ways in which politics is not just going to the voting booth, but actually engaging in a life as a citizen. And once again, this is what good ancient democracy was very good at, and it was good at the local level as well as at the national level. I think that's what we need to find ways to do that. And surely we've got enough inventiveness. We can do it. It's not that the Athenians were cleverer than we are, and it's not just that they had a smaller scale and therefore it was easier. We can do it. We just need to have the will to do it.
Jan?
I very much agree that democracy should start at the local level, because this is where participation is most meaningful. And this is where democracy of culture is possible for various reasons, because of identity and common experience. And the problem, of course, is how you replicate this on other levels which are important to solve problems which are not local. And here, my major problem is with the statism, with the obsessions of the state, nation state, which basically controls both local and transnational government. Because if you look at the European Union, who is at the decision-making table? These are only states. Some of them are clearly not democratic. Some of them are tiny. Some of them are bankrupt. If not, you wonder whether they are sovereign. What kind of state is Cyprus? Is anybody from Cyprus? If you would be from Cyprus, you would know what I mean. And at this decision-making table, there are no, for instance, large cities, which are much more vibrant democratic units, which deal with the most important problems we have on a daily basis, like hospitals, schools, migration, employment. They are not there. They don't have any access to decision-making and resources. And the worst even is on the global level, in the United Nations, or even look at G20. I mean, some of those peoples in G20 are not just autocrats, but gangsters. I'm not going to mention them. But you see, and these are the bodies which are running, which have monopoly on this transnational decision-making. And I'm totally appalled by that. And yet, somehow we cannot get out of this idea that somebody else is here, a proper polity and democratic unit to be included into the decision-making process. And I'm not talking about the idea like our late Tony Barber, that if the mayors would run the world, it would be all better. No, because mayors could be as bad as prime ministers. That's not the point. The point is about opening up system. Why don't we, for instance, create a second chamber of European Parliament with other bodies, with regional representatives, with municipal representatives, with maybe NGOs, maybe entrepreneurs, I don't know. But see, try to experiment, to open up a little bit the system, to break the stalemate we found ourselves, and which is increasingly dysfunctional. So this is the major problem, that we somehow are unable to even say things which in other contexts we would find as obvious. Like we all agree, that cities are engines of modernizations, innovation also. But when you come to European politics, nobody talks about cities. Everybody agrees that local democracy is stronger than European democracy. But yet, where is the place for those people? So that is a paradox which we hopefully will overcome. But as I said, behind all institutional solutions, there are vested interests. And it is not so easy to break them. It's not just about intellectual paradigms, it's about political bargaining, if not struggle. And we know it from feminist movements. We know it now. You know, when I read how Greta Thunberg is being really totally squashed by politicians from all different orientations, not in Germany, but in other countries, I see how difficult it is, even for those seemingly innocent like Greta Thunberg, to get through vested interest, and it's unbelievable.
Brief final comments on?
Yes, I would like to talk to your point about the point that social media can actually split societies, right? And I think this is really one of, actually the issue that worries me the most when it comes to the rise of social media and digitalization, because indeed it fosters a divide in society that we haven't seen to this extent, at least not in the more recent past. And because we get access mainly then to those and self-select into those communities that actually reconfirm what we think ourselves anyways, this makes it so difficult to have then respect for the political opponent. And I think this is really a key challenge that fosters polarization of society. And we know from all political theorists that we need some sort of a basic level of respect and of mutual trust in a society so that democracies can work, speaking of culture, right? So for me, it's really the number one priority that we find ways to overcome these dividing function of social media, be it through online activities that bring people together and that show more objective news or news from the other side to everyone. And I'm also very encouraged by projects that bring people together matched on like that they actually have really different opinions to meet and discuss, and to see that actually the world wouldn't end if the other side would win the elections.
Thanks for that, and I think we're over time. We've covered a lot of territory, discussed the importance of political leadership, the need to reinvigorate or transform democratic institutions, and technology's role in being part of the problem, but also a rather optimistic assessment from many in the panel about its potential role in bringing about some solutions. So with that, please join me in thanking Anna, Jan, and Josiah.